Here in our museum are some of the most valuable pieces of art and history that we have. These beautiful silver bowls and goblets were made by the famous American patriot, Paul Revere.
Tell him about the ride. Tell him about the ride. I was there, you know.
Of course, Paul Revere is most famous for a ride he made.
I told you. You'll see. He couldn't have done it without me.
A ride from Boston, Massachusetts, all over the countryside to warn the people that the British were on the march.
The British are coming. The British are coming. That's what he said.
By this time in the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies had begun to argue with the powerful mother country, England. The colonists had begun to lead their own lives. They didn't know it, but they were becoming Americans. Secret organizations were formed to spread the word and spirit of freedom among the colonists. They even had secret hiding places for their meetings.
Shh. Shh.
One of their most trusted messengers was Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith who loved galloping across New England with messages from one leader to another, until suddenly, soldiers, British soldiers, were sent to keep order in the colonies. Paul Revere was no longer a messenger. He was a spy.
I regret that I have but one tale to give for my country.
One of the patriot leaders Paul worked for was Sam Adams. Sam, Paul, and others, disguised as Indians, went charging up the gangways of 3 ships in Boston Harbor, and they had themselves a tea party.
Woo, woo, me Indian, made you rain dance. Hey, it worked. Yikes, my disguise.
From a waterfront conversation, the word leaked out. The British were going to march on Lexington and Concord, arrest Sam Adams, and destroy a secret ammunition storehouse. They expected no resistance. But Paul Revere heard, and he knew he must warn the Minutemen, the good farmers of Lexington and Concord. Paul met with a friend and arranged for a signal to be sent from the tower of the Old North Church. 1 light if the British were to start their march by land, and 2 lights if they were coming by sea. Paul silently left the Old North Church, dodged down back alleys, climbed into a rowboat, and silently rowed across the bay. A British man-of-war swayed gently at her moorings, but Paul made it to the other side. Alone, he waited in a dark stable for hours.
What do you mean, alone? I was there. I was the one who saw the signal. There. 1 light. They're marching by land. This way, Paul. Let's go.
2 lights. They're coming by sea. That's all I wanted to know.
2 lights? Hey! Wait for me! Hey!
Through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. By 12 o'clock, Paul Revere crossed the bridge into Medford. The village clock read 1 when he arrived in Lexington. At 2, he was in Concord. All along the route, he called to the people.
The British are coming. Defend yourselves. Defend liberty and freedom. The British are coming.
And the people responded. The next morning, the only ones surprised were the British. The Minutemen stood and fought, and the British retreated in confusion. Paul Revere's warning had come in time. The first battles of the American Revolutionary War had been fought. There were other riders that night, but because of a poem written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the man we remember most is Paul Revere.
And who do you think helped Longfellow write that poem? Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. The most, that's who. But that's another story.
Here is our frontier room. The powder horns, the old rifles, the danger and adventure of the early American frontier. and the greatest pioneer of those early days, Daniel Boone.
Yep, I remember Daniel. Me and him cleared the old wilderness road together. Ah, them was the days. But now they're gone. Old tick liquor here's rusted, only good for gathering dust. But someday she'll fire again.
On November 2nd, 1734, Daniel Boone was born in a log cabin in Pennsylvania. Boone's parents owned a small farm, a weaving establishment, and a blacksmith shop, and Daniel helped with the farming. Daniel's father bought additional farmland miles from their home, and there Daniel went to live and work. Here he began to learn the ways of the forest.
Uh-oh.
Friendly Indians lived near the farm, and from them, Daniel learned Indian habits so well that many years later, when he fought them, he knew all their tricks. When he was 12, he began to hunt with a rifle his father had given him. He became a skilled woodsman with a quick hand and a keen eye. When Daniel was 18, his family moved to the frontier country of North Carolina. There, Daniel hunted for the family while his brothers and father farmed. In 1754, the French and Indian Wars broke out. In 1755, the English general Edward Braddock came to America to seize Fort Duquesne from the French. He needed volunteers, and among the volunteers was Boone, now 21. The expedition slowly cut its way through the forest, and it was during this time that Boone heard tales about Kentucky, the hunter's paradise. He longed to go, but no one knew how to cross the Allegheny Mountains to get to Kentucky. Boone determined to find a way. The French and Indians attacked. Braddock's army fled, and Boone escaped. When he was 22, Boone married Rebecca Bryan, his neighbor's 15-year-old daughter. It was a good marriage. Always Boone pushed deeper into the woods. He needed room, and Rebecca went with him. One day, an old friend came to Boone's cabin, John Finley, one of the other drivers of Braddock's expedition. He told Boone of an Indian trail, the Warrior's Path, which led into Kentucky. But Finley was no woodsman. He needed Boone to find the trail.
Wait for me!
Boone found the trail. Indians on the warpath had used it for centuries. Through the Cumberland Mountains, at Cumberland Gap, then into Kentucky. In 1775, Richard Henderson bought a large tract of land from the Indians in Kentucky and sent Boone at the head of a group of woodsmen to improve the narrow Indian trails. Thus was created the Great Wilderness Road, the bridge to the west. In 1775, in Kentucky, Boonesboro was built. Here, Boone and his family lived. Many times the pioneer village was attacked by hostile Indians. Many times after that, Boonesboro was attacked, but each time the Indians were repelled. Boone went through many other adventures and died at the age of 86.
Yep, me and Daniel did a lot to open the frontier. The West is civilized now, but someday, whenever again they need hunters and woodsmen, Max will be there, feeding them all. Hey, wait a minute. Hey,
Here is our room of American folk heroes. And here we find the story of Johnny Appleseed, who planted apple trees wherever he went.
I remember Johnny. He was a good guy. Never hurt anybody. Kind to animals. Everybody loved him. Why, he was as American as apple pie.
150 years ago, the American frontier was just opening. People were moving west, setting up farms, planting, harvesting. All sorts of things grew, corn and wheat, maple trees and oak trees. But something was missing.
Banana trees?
Apple trees. The only place apple trees grew was in the east. John Chapman was a young man at this time, and he had a way with living things. His apple trees were the biggest in the land. his vegetables the tastiest. Some people said he could even talk with the animals.
Talk with the animals? In English? Now I've heard everything.
All the time, folks were leaving apple country and heading for the wilderness. But Johnny stayed where he was, taking care of his apple trees.
Probably talk to them, too.
Johnny gave his apples away and hoped that the pioneers would plant the seeds. But there were many people heading out, and Johnny knew that his orchard was too small to supply them all with seeds. So he decided to go west himself, getting seeds wherever he could and giving them away to the people he met. He filled a sack with seeds, put an old kettle on his head so he could have a hat and a cooking pot all in one, and then he set out. Pretty soon people began to call him Johnny Appleseed. He soon ran out of seeds. Only one thing to do.
Want some orange pits?
The farmers used to press their apples to make cider, and the seeds were thrown away. So Johnny asked the farmers for the seeds. All winter he gathered the seeds, and in the spring he gave them away. Johnny was happy for a while, but often a pioneer would return east, and Johnny would find out that the man forgot to plant the seeds, or the trees died. So Johnny Appleseed decided to plant the seeds himself. He left his boat and started walking. He'd plant his seeds in the little corner of a pioneer farm. And the pioneer families would invite him in, for folks were kind to travelers in those days. And then he'd be off again. He was friends with everyone, with the Indians, the pioneers, even with the wild animals. For Johnny never harmed any living creature. One day, Johnny found a great wolf caught in a trap. Unafraid of the sharp teeth, Johnny freed it. He bandaged the wolf's leg and took care of it. And when the wolf was better and Johnny got up to go,
It ate him up.
the wolf went with him, and they were always together after that. But one day, a farmer, new to the frontier, shot the wolf. Johnny was tired, and he missed his old friend Wolf. He lay down against an apple tree and closed his eyes. The next day, a woodsman came upon a strange sight, the still body of an old man, and all around, a circle of wild animals.
Yeah, Johnny Appleseed was quite a guy. Next time you eat an apple, think of Johnny. And don't throw away those seeds. Johnny's bag is empty now. But someday...
Here in our Hall of American Folk Heroes, we have the very rifle that Davy Crockett used to carry. Old Betsy, he called it. Davy was an amazing fellow. Woodsman, Indian fighter, even congressman.
Oh, Davy and me was great pals. Shooting Indians and hunting raccoons and trapping bars. Ah, I'll never forget them days.
Davy Crockett was born in Tennessee in 1786. The country was pretty wild in those days, and young Davy got to know the forest and its creatures like the back of his hand. He learned to recognize the tracks of wild animals.
A bear, I'd say.
He practiced moving through the forest silently, learned to read the signs of a broken leaf or a bent twig, learned patience. He'd have to wait for hours maybe for game to come into range. And when it did, he had to be a perfect shot the first time. He grew up into an expert woodsman. Stories about him spread far and wide. Davy went raccoon hunting one day. Now, Davy had a big grin. He grinned up at he grinned that raccoon right out of the tree. From that day on, Davy did all his raccoon hunting by grinning at him. It got to the point where he didn't even have to grin. The raccoons recognized Davy and just gave up, figuring they were goners anyway. Another time, Davy was hunting. Suddenly, earthquake. Davy fell into the crack. Davy grabbed the bear, and the bear pulled him out. The bear was friendly. They hugged each other. The bear almost hugged Davy to death. Davy named him Old Death Hug. Davy tamed Old Death Hug, and they traveled all over Tennessee together. And when they were tired, they'd sit down and share a pipe. When he was 18, Davy married Polly Finley. And some folks said she had a grin almost as big as Davy's. About this time, the War of 1812 began. Davy became a scout for Andrew Jackson. Davy fought against the Cree Indians. After the war, he served in the Tennessee legislature. And in 1827, he was nominated for the U.S. Congress. One story goes that Davy was in a debate with his opponent. The other fellow was speaking when all of a sudden, the fellow was drowned out by... Crockett! 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 And Davy got up and said that the hens who had wandered in were saying his name. Crockett! 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 Well, the story was repeated everywhere, and Davy won the election. He served 3 terms and voted according to what he always believed. Be sure you're right, then go ahead.
I think we should get rid of them. We should have taken...
Many times he disagreed with President Jackson, especially about Indian policy. For Andrew Jackson wanted to take their lands away, and Davy didn't think that was right. After leaving Congress, Davy headed for Texas, which was fighting for its independence from Mexico. He joined the Americans defending the Alamo. They knew they were outnumbered, but they wanted freedom. The Mexicans attacked. Davy and the other defenders knew they couldn't win, but they wouldn't give up. And Davy and all the rest died, fighting for what they believed in.
I think I finally got it right.
Does this seem like a strange place to begin a story about freedom? Well, the horse here stands for a man so free, so unbroken and strong that he inspired his people to rise up like a roaring stampede across the great American West. This is the story of a man with all the spirit of a wild Indian stallion, a man called Crazy Horse.
Crazy Horse? Wow. Sound like a funny name to you? Well, listen. He was a horse that no one could ride, because he was the mightiest Indian chief of them all. How do I know? I'm Max. I'm 2,000 years old.
About 100 years ago, a great Sioux Indian chief was stirring up the dust of the western plains into the smoke of war. His name, Red Cloud. After years of peace, 39 Indian Sioux were hanged in Minnesota, and the trouble spread west to Wyoming, where Red Cloud, bent on revenge, thundered onto the prairie with a handful of young chiefs. Among them was Crazy Horse. He was only 16, but he was learning his lessons on fighting from Red Cloud, and Red Cloud was a master, striking like summer lightning across the open plain, engulfing their enemy, then disappearing behind their own dust, back into the hills, down the rocky riverbanks, behind dark forests, where all would be still once more. The army, with their much larger horses and ponderous equipment, was unable to pursue, and so the trouble continued for years. Eventually, peace came, and by terms of the treaty, the Sioux were given practically all of a place called the Dakotas. You see, the name Sioux was only the name they were called by the French. Their real name for themselves was Dakota. The Sioux, happy with the terms of the treaty, promised to stop fighting and turn to ways of peace, like farming.
Ain't gonna follow no more. Ain't gonna follow no more. Yes, sir. We're burying the hatchet.
Not long after the hatchets were buried, the most incredible cry burst out from the Dakotas.
Gold! Gold!
With the speed of the telegraph and Pony Express, like lightning, the news got around. Tremendous find made on Sioux land. The discovery of dolls. The year was 1876, and Crazy Horse knew it meant trouble. The treaty was finished, torn up. The Sioux set about making weapons and painting their face for war. They meant to drive the gold diggers out of their lands. But the gold diggers had friends. They had, in fact, an army. But the brave chief refused to quit. In fact, he attacked. On a fine June day at Rosebud Creek, Crazy Horse, with 1,200 Sioux and Cheyenne allies, came thundering out of nowhere, caught the army flat-footed, and forced them to give up, to retreat. But Crazy Horse knew the Rosebud was only a temporary victory. Needing more allies, he sent hurried messengers to get them.
Look, message from Crazy Horse.
Chief Sitting Bull, I presume?
Thus, an important alliance was formed. Chief Sitting Bull and his band of braves promised to join up with Crazy Horse at a place called the Little Bighorn River, which is precisely the place where another army force, under the command of none other than the famous General George Armstrong Custer, was heading. On June 25th, 1876, the forces met, collided head-on, and what happened is American history, written by two armies of valiant Americans, Pioneer and Indian. The Indian won that day, but there weren't many more left. Other armies came. Soon Sitting Bull retreated into Canada, and Crazy Horse, he was too proud to retreat. He stayed and fought for his land until all his allies left him, until he was finally beaten. So the horse is here to remind us of the man whose daring deeds helped mold one of the proudest traditions of the American West, the spirit of freedom, the man called Crazy Horse.
Well, I knew him, and I say he wasn't crazy. And you? What do you say?
American Hall. Here the greats, the makers of the American character and nation, are rightfully remembered. Columbus, who sailed into seas unknown and found a new world. Washington, indispensable leader who beat the British and brought together a nation. Lincoln, who kept that nation whole. And him? Well, once he did more to spread the name of young America throughout the world than any explorer or soldier or president.
Hi!
Can you guess his identity?
Psst. Hey, it's me, Max the Mouse.
No, it's not a big rock and roll star. It's...
Right! It's Buffalo Max. Ta-da!
Just around the turn of the century, this buffalo you see here came to symbolize all that was wild and exciting in the American West. Roaming wide and free over the Great Plain, he was constantly hunted by Indians, pursued by civilization. So he finally moved east, taking his West with him, a feat which probably saved him from extinction. But this is the story of a man whose world reputation for adventure earned for him forever the nickname Buffalo Bill Cody, P.T. Barnum of the Plains.
Yahoo!
About 100 years ago, on a dusty, windswept plain, a boy was growing up on a horse when the West was really wild. The Army Scout, young Bill Cody. His job, dispatch rider for the Union General Phil Sheridan. Time, the Civil War. His mission, get important Army messages through Indian country alone. The Indians were the mounted brigades, the proud Comanches, then often called the finest light cavalry in all the world. And they weren't very friendly. By the time he was 18, Bill's experience taught him how to elude capture. As a former Pony Express rider and mounted messenger for the freight lines, he was a master of every trick in the book. One of his favorite tricks was to run his horse down an overgrown riverbed where the Indians would have to chase after the sound. Then he'd jump off his galloping mount, double back on his own trail, and lay low while the braves went racing by. Occasionally there were battles, but Bill always challenged the last Indian through for his horse.
When he started chasing me, he tripped himself up. Get it?
After the fall of the Confederacy, Bill left the Army, got married, and went a-working for the Kansas Pacific Railroad. They hired Bill, his horse, and his gun to get meat for the construction crews, buffalo meat. You see, it was the only meat around. If the construction crews were going to get fed, it would have to be on buffalo meat. Bill Cody, by his own count, killed more than 4,000 buffalo. He now became known as Buffalo Bill. If the Indians didn't like the sight of a single rider passing through their lands, how do you think they reacted when they saw thousands going through on rails?
They went working on the railroad, right?
Well, they did try to untie things.
See?
So the Army went to war again, and Bill Cody, Buffalo Bill, went with it against the Indians, Sioux and Cheyenne. In roughly 5 years, Buffalo Bill was in 16 fights.
And boy, that's rough.
Buffalo Bill was now the most famous man in the West. Hundreds of stories, books, and novels were written about him. His fame became worldwide. Millions clamored for him. They would do anything to see him. They would even pay. So he packed up his cowboys and Indians, even his buffalo, the whole Wild West, in fact, and headed east. It was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. New York, Chicago, Europe, they even played a command performance for England's Queen Victoria, spreading the fame of Buffalo Bill and the young American nation clear around the world. Oh, there were others, but he was the first man to truly popularize the American West and give it the image it still has today.